I didn't like mushrooms because I think it was too body oriented, and the LSD was very mental, and that was a safe place for me.
Welcome to the Greener Grass podcast from BlueBird Botanicals. I'm your host, Lex Pelger. The unconscious mind is a treasure trove of valuable information. Unfortunately, it can also harbor monsters from our past. Childhood trauma can get stored in our bodies where it wreaks havoc on our lives. Jen Fiser of Innate Path in Denver recognizes the power of psychedelics to take what is unconscious and make it conscious. Innate Path uses ketamine or cannabis combined with dedicated therapy and a somatic body-based approach to help patients relieve their problems. This episode gives some insight into how these medicines actually work when used by trained professionals like Jen Fiser. This show is brought to you by BlueBird Botanicals to spread education about cannabis and other things on the greener side of life. BlueBird CBD oil comes from farms in southern Colorado and is grown using only water, soil, and sunlight. Go to bluebirdbotanicals.com for more info. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with Jen Fiser of Innate Path. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
And before we get into your work here, I was curious about when you were young, what was it that you wanted to do?
That's an interesting question. When I was little, I wanted to be a dancer and an artist and a singer.
Did you get to pursue some of that while you were started this path of training?
No, not at all. But I have been shocked where my career trajectory has gone. But when I look back on it, it makes sense. It's like I can see where all of the points of interest started to form and coalesce and lead me down this road.
That's great. How did it first get started, your training and the path that you took?
Well, when I was younger, I struggled with a lot of trauma symptoms from some things I had been through as a child and a teenager. And I was very anxious and starting to show signs of PTSD through my 20s. And I thought that was what was going on, but I read voraciously. I tried to, try to figure out what was going on. I read a lot of philosophy, things like that. And I also engaged with a lot of LSD at the time. And it was like my best friend. But I was just trying to sort out my own issues and figure out the meaning of my own trauma and what was going on. And I didn't see it as a career. I became a teacher and I taught middle school. And that was amazing experience. And I started to heal through that experience. And I started to realize, because I wasn't, my social anxiety started to ease through that experience. So I just started to realize how the classroom could be very therapeutic, which led me to therapy, and which led me to, realizing that all of that stuff had come from my own trauma, which led me to explore some modalities that could work with that. And I came across the modality we use here at the clinic, which is a somatic modality, and then got led back into the field of psychedelics, which if you had told me that I was going to be doing what I'm doing right now when I was 25, I would have been like out of my mind. I would have been like totally shocked that was possible.
And just to go back a little bit, can you talk about teaching and how the classroom helped you work through this stuff? Because I guess if you can get through it with middle schoolers, you can survive anywhere, I guess is the idea.
Well, like I said, when I was in my early 20s, I used a lot of LSD, which gave me a very interesting perspective. So I was teaching middle school from the perspective of not being a disciplinarian or someone that was controlling, and I saw it as being more creative and friendly. And so in a sense, I kind of re-engaged my own self from those years in the work I was doing in this community. And it was a community school. It was an alternative school. I had a ton of creative freedom, and it was very community oriented. And so I learned the value of community, which I hadn't ever known.
And can you tell why LSD as the first experiences, and how did they go for you?
I suspect that it was LSD because it helped. I was a teen mom, and I was, I had a rough existence in my early 20s, and so it was the one thing that helped me not over-identify with that. I would lose my identity, my sense of identity, which was a good thing, and it was freeing. But also, I think LSD isn't very body-oriented. So, unlike mushrooms, for example, because I tried everything, and I didn't like mushrooms, because I think it was too body-oriented, and the LSD was very mental, and that was a safe place for me.
It's interesting because the secret chief, Dr. Leo Zeff, he would always start his patients on LSD before he would try the other range of chemicals that he would typically use, which isn't usually how things go today in the underground or the above ground. And so it's intriguing that was the one that called to you first.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if he wasn't intuitively starting people with mind, which is what we're most comfortable with, in Western society, and then moving into things that were more body-based, which we're not so comfortable with.
Hypothetically, if you were to have a regular person, you could give them any drug in any order. Would you have a specific order that would come to mind of the correct path or a path that would make sense?
I think that's a great question. I don't think there's a prescription for anyone in particular, but I think having a variety of medicines, they could be used in certain orders for certain people. So I wouldn't necessarily start anyone out in any one particular place, actually. There's a lot of different factors to take into consideration.
And that leads to questions about your training. And so how did it go to decide to be a therapist and then start moving down that path of study?
Well, I decided to become a therapist because I needed to go back to school to keep my teaching license. And I started exploring graduate schools, and I didn't like them. I didn't like the pedagogical perspective. So I just came out here to go to Naropa to their contemplative program because I figured it wouldn't hurt me, because I love Buddhist philosophy, and I certainly could use the discipline of meditation. So I came out and did the contemplative program, not thinking that I was going to ever be a therapist. I thought I was going to take it back into teaching.
And for those of you who don't know, Naropa is a fascinating Buddhist-centered school in Boulder, Colorado, that is known for their school of poetics, disembodied poetics, I think, as well as their therapy program and their contemplative. And so what was it like so you did therapy at Naropa as well? You did the training after the contemplative course?
Yeah, so I did the Masters of Contemplative Psychotherapy, and then I did the trauma training afterward.
And so what kind of modalities did you get to learn there, and why did the somatic-centered ones start making the most sense for you?
I was learning meditation, and it was a contemplative point of view almost entirely. I don't think we were learning much of anything else, just the Buddhist framework for psychology, and lots of experientials through meditation. And I think what began to occur to me, I don't know if I was aware of what was missing, but I was managing PTSD symptoms with meditation. And anytime something dysregulating came up, I would just meditate more. Then in the third year of my program, I was in a supervision group with somebody who was taking the training that we use here at the clinic, the first round that they'd ever done of this training. They were taking it, and I heard what they were studying. I was so jealous. Like, I could tell It was something completely different.
And what's the training and what was it like?
So the training is a somatic training, meaning it's body focused. And it's looking at therapeutic intervention from a bottom up way, not the top down way we typically look at therapy. So, I mean, normally we try to find ways of managing symptoms, coping with symptoms, maybe gaining insight into why we do something. You know, meditation's interesting because it like gets you to train your mind, and that's something. But this was speaking to, why do we even have symptoms? You know, like where is our dis-ease coming from? And it's, you know, about speaking to childhood events and the way trauma is held in the body, the way attachment is held in the body. And that really rings true to somebody who's avoided their body their whole life and knows that's the source of their trauma. And like, duh. It was, it's a program through the Love and Trauma Center at the time.
Okay.
It was created by Eric Walterstorff originally, the basics of it. We've built on it quite a bit since then, but the basics of it is this map of the autonomic nervous system and how it responds to threat in mammals. And it came out of Peter Levine's original dissertation. And Eric like kind of honed this map and turned it into like a 3D map that shows not only why we would have symptoms, like where those symptoms would be coming from, but also how to resolve the symptoms. It's really neat.
The anecdote I learned about this from my wife, who was in the same program, about Peter Levine's work, is the fear an animal gets when it gets attacked but escapes attack. And then usually what it would do in the wild is shake for a couple minutes and shake off that energy and that fear. And it's one of the things that modern humans have lost, and one of the reasons that this trauma gets saved here. And so I guess that's one of the original ideas that led to this three-dimensional map that you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah, that's the original idea. And it's kind of a simple way of explaining it, but it makes sense. And then there's a whole lot of complexity around it when it comes to human beings.
Because you hear that idea about perhaps the unconscious mind is really the body, and that's what we're talking about. That's where those feelings are coming from. And so I wonder how that would map onto what you're talking about.
One way of looking at that, we use a couple of metaphors, but I'm going to start in another place, which is as we have very extended childhoods as children, as humans. And it takes a very long time for us to build any sort of independent defense structure. And the part of our mind that we identify with as the executive function doesn't really start coming on board until quite a bit into our lives, and doesn't mature until those early 20s. So a majority of and we have these extended childhoods because we're so complex. It takes so much muscle memory. It takes so much programming to allow us to function at that adult level, because we need to be able to not have to think about everything. So we have these extended times in a space that isn't that rational, reasonable, linear place. That's developed later on. So like our entire infancy, our entire early childhood, most of up through almost to high school is in what we would consider to be a more subconscious place. It's where muscle memory and our emotional memory and our relational strategies and belief systems and everything are developed. And if you think about like what it's like to be an infant is all body. They're all body and emotion, and they don't have any sort of reasoning on board yet, but they're having a huge experience, and it's very fundamental to what they're going to map the world out to be as they grow up. And that experience is being encoded in their body. So in a major way, most of our encoding as children is done and held in a subconscious place. And then also so there's that, but there's also Peter Levine's work, which says that we have this autonomic nervous system, meaning that it isn't within our control, that's also reacting and coding things. And that's, like the part of our nervous system that is happening without us thinking about it. Like we don't beat our heart, sort of a thing. We don't digest our food. We don't regulate our blood sugar. That's all autonomic. And we have that also going on as a response to threat.
It reminds me of something Aldous Huxley said, that it delights him that 99% of his brain cells have no idea who Aldous Huxley is. And I guess it really speaks to the power of this, of focusing on the body, that supports so much of this gray matter we have spinning out the ideas. And I'm especially intrigued by the tied infants. I actually have an 11-month-old at home, and it's amazing to see how much gets absorbed so quickly, like pouring water onto dry sand. And I know Robert Sapolsky talks about the idea that the more we learn about early childhood development, the less that in criminal law and things like that, people be responsible for their actions, because the amount of damage that's done there can be so severe that it basically short circuits someone's executive function, that they're not in rational control in some manner, and that this kind of work with the body could be something that could be really helpful for that, since that's where so much of the trauma is locked up.
Right. What I think Robert Sapolsky's getting at in saying that is that we are responding to threat all the time. We can either respond to it in a way that is successful, or we can respond to it in a way that's unsuccessful. Threat can get encoded in our bodies as not having a solution. So if we're exposed to too much threat as a child through the neglect of our parents, or even through the threat of our parents, then we hold a lot of our relationships and a lot of the world in a place of not having a solution to the threat of them. When that happens, we react, our nervous system reacts to that encoded threat from an unsuccessful place, and it hijacks us. So if we have a ton of threat in the world through relationships are threatening, the world is threatening, because we had so many events happen to us as children that we weren't protected from, that we didn't have any power over, so we never encoded those threats as something we could meet confidently. Then as adults, we add to those accumulations of threats in our environment. We're always being triggered. I had a really interesting conversation with someone just the other day about is free will possible? And they were bringing up Robert Sapolsky. Like, is it even possible to have free will when you have so much trauma in your nervous system? And I would say, that is, I personally feel like the true privilege in our world is in what the nervous system holds. So like, it is a true privilege to not have a jacked up nervous system from childhood trauma and intergenerational trauma and systemic trauma. Because you have so much more available in the present moment. You're more in the present moment. You have more of your encoding saying that you can successfully manage the world. And it's like exponential. It just opens the world up to you. If you have a lot of threat encoded in your system as unsuccessful, like you don't have a solution to it, your family doesn't have a solution to it, that sort of a thing, then the part of your nervous system that comes on when that threat is triggered is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is associated with trauma. And it's dissociative, and it doesn't manage a threat in a way that feels good or intelligent. It's like it takes you down when you want to fight. It takes all your feeling away when you need to be feeling. It's like it really works against you in trying to meet that threat, because what it's saying is you don't have a solution for this threat, so you need to leave. You need to dissociate, or you need to like wait for help.
Using that framework, can you talk about the medicines that you use here at Innate Path and how you set someone out to take them, and then how they kind of interact with this trauma and how you help using them?
So the training that I took in this modality back in the way back when, one of the people that was the trainers on that team was one of the investigators in the phase 2 PTSD for MDMA for PTSD trial in Boulder, and was able to get a few clients into that study and notice that the synergy between working from that bottom up, body focused, looking at threat, looking at trauma way, and bringing a psychedelic medicine on board was just synergistic. Like really took this work to a totally new level. And so, we were super excited and, like really wanting to help MAPS, like get these studies through and everything. And then in our private practice, just like crying because, here we're working with clients and we're going at a snail's pace through this work. It works, but it's painful to know that someone's struggling through something when they could do it so much deeper and faster with the right support. And so, we just were open to anything that would come along. And one person's, a client of someone's, was going to the ketamine treatment center and invited their therapist to come with them. And so, that's kind of history. And it's like, ketamine's a psychedelic and it's available to us. So, let's start using it in that way. And so we did a lot of work with private practice clients with ketamine for a while. They were getting it prescribed and taking it in the session. And then had clients start going, well, what about cannabis? Because when I'm home and I'm like using it at night, my body goes into these waves. It's like totally processing some of this stuff. And we're like, yeah, bring it into the session and let's see what happens. And that's where we started to realize that there were medicines beyond MDMA or beyond other psychedelics that would work. So, the psychedelic quality of the medicine does a very similar thing to going in through that body channel, because the body does exist mostly in the subconscious, and the psychedelics also open up that subconscious. That's what Aldous Huxley's talking about. It's like his subconscious is vast. So what we work with here is we are a psychotherapy clinic. We have a modality that's bottom up. We work from a body focused, working from that map of trauma, working from a sense of getting at why the symptoms are existing, even using the symptoms as an intelligent guide back into what's going on, where they're coming from. And then people bring medicines in here that are available now, like ketamine is a medicine and cannabis is just recreationally available. And we use them in a very similar way to synergize each other.
And if someone comes in not knowing anything about ketamine, how do you describe it to them and how you're going to work with it together?
Yeah, so, we can't give advice. So for ketamine, if someone comes in and they're interested in it, or we're just talking about it and they develop an interest in it, then we refer them to medical advice. But we can tell them, what we've seen. And so basically, when someone is interested in our work here, it's very deep. It's a commitment. It's a very relational, sometimes difficult process to make contact with that core programming. So when someone gets a hold of us, I will meet with them first as the clinical supervisor and just talk to them about what their interests are. And so like I share with them what other people have seen and what we see as therapists in terms of, how we see these medicines working or these substances working. And ketamine is it's like it opens up a lucid dream state. And so if you think about, like some of the nightmares you have, some of the recurring nightmares, what if, you could intentionally bring one on? And then you bring an ally in with you and someone that knows how to work with that terrain to bring about a resolution to that nightmare. And you just hold hands and step into that space together. That's kind of ketamine.
When you see a monster, give them a kiss.
Yeah. And there's always interesting advice, right? You read the advice that, Johns Hopkins is using in the psilocybin studies where they're like, if you meet a monster, ask them, what do you need to tell me? Why are you here? Or something like that.
And I'm curious about what level of ketamine you use, because some modalities like to go very deep and completely dissociate somebody's brain, and others are just barely microdosing it, it seems like.
Well, the person that we're in relationship with around the prescribing, they've taken our training too. And so they know kind of what we're going for, and they prescribe accordingly. And we want a therapeutic dose. We want the dream to be lucid. We want to be able to relate and talk all the way through it. So I know in some, in some of the ketamine clinics, they may use higher doses to do something different. But we're looking for a therapeutic dose, which isn't a microdose. It's a full-on working dose.
And are there people that you definitely don't want to do this with? Are there certain preconditions that preclude you from using it?
The prescriber has their own rule outs. We're looking for anybody doing this work, whether they're working with ketamine or whether we're working with cannabis. And I think, cannabis is actually really interesting, a really interesting part of this that we've discovered. But regardless of which one they're working with, we're looking for people to have the resources to go through this process. That's our big rule out. So, do people have enough support? Do they have the physical capacity to make it to the other side of some potentially big physical processing? And sometimes people are just in too gnarly of a place to be able to do this right now.
And so for frequency, it seems like from the literature, some people just need one session and others need to come back for weeks, extended periods of time. What generally works for how you do things?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think definitely in the psychedelic world, there's an idea that psychedelics are a magic pill. But if you look into it, I mean, if we all really think about it, even people that have had life-changing experiences from one or two psychedelic events, they don't stop there. Often they continue to seek out that experience and to learn more, to heal more. We get a lot of people into curious about our work who have done extensive amounts of psychedelics in their past. But what they haven't found is like how to heal some trauma piece that's still recurring, So I just want to put that out there. I think it's a myth, a total myth, that you could do this once or for a few weeks or something like that. We're really looking at opening up our core programming and doing some really serious healing. So some people, it's like we have to sit down and look at the territory. And it's not necessarily territory that you do consistently from from the beginning to the end. It's like you can take it in chunks and take breaks and come back for a little piece. I have had a lot of people, let's say they work pretty solidly for 4 months, and then, they're feeling really good. And a year later, they're like, hey, that piece that we wondered if it was going to come up, came up, and I need to work on it now.
And so can you tell me more about cannabis and what it's like to work with that when it's often a less predictable psychoactive?
Yeah. And predictable is an interesting word that I'm surprised you're using that. And it actually is an interesting word for this, because I think it's actually malleable. We've been so surprised by the cannabis piece. So, everybody that comes in tries their own formula for what they want to use in the sessions, and we found some things work better than others, but cannabis can, with this set and setting, actually become a full-on psychedelic and often mimic a variety of psychedelics. So I've had people say to me, wow, this is just like a mushroom session. This feels just like 5-MeO or something like that. And it does seem to really be like a chameleon and very powerful when used therapeutically. We just did a project where we had a group of combat vets with PTSD, and they all were using cannabis to manage PTSD symptoms. And they chose to use cannabis for the therapy and used cannabis at lower doses than they had been using to manage it. And were having full-on psychedelic experiences, processing from our point of view of processing through the body, and doing massive amounts of work just with cannabis. And they'd been using cannabis for years. So
it's amazing what the settings and the expectations can do. What my father always says is, a group of friends going into the woods to take mushrooms together, so much of the magic of the experience is everyone deciding we're going to go hang out with no agenda for a day. And the drugs help, but the intention of doing it is so powerful. So it's fascinating to hear how much less you need, especially with cannabis. And it makes sense, too, because cannabis interacts with the psychedelic receptors, with the 5-HT2A, and it's why they seem to work well. Do you ever combine cannabis and ketamine, or is that a little too much?
That would be something that someone would have to discuss with their prescriber. I mean, it seems like overkill.
Just curious. I know that there are some
seems like
burners
overkill,
out there
but no,
curious.
That's never happened in our clinic.
And speaking hypothetically, if there was no Controlled Substances Act, would you have any psychoactives of most interest that you would like to explore next?
I think we're super interested in psilocybin. Really excited about that. MDMA is amazing for body processing. Our fantasy would be to be able to use all of these at different points in someone's process.
And what advice would you have for someone who is hearing about this from you and is considering diving in, both into body work and into using these substances?
Do a little bit of research. We've tried to put a bunch of our information on our website, and that'll continue. We really have a strong mission of education. Look into, what's out there and what resonates with you. And as far as being interested in working at this clinic, call us and come in and talk to us. We are accepting clients, so there's no wait list yet. So call us.
What's coming up in the future that's exciting for Innate Path and your work?
We are really excited about two things. One, we're putting together a program evaluation, and it's pretty extensive with one of the researchers at Johns Hopkins to measure. We're going to run everybody that comes to the clinic through a series of measures and keep track of those numbers and really have some data within the next year to speak from. And we're super excited about that. And it's going to be an amazing program evaluation. And we're also very excited about the educational opportunities that are coming up. We're working with some people in the cannabis industry to start educating the cannabis community about the potential of using cannabis therapeutically. We're looking at potentially doing some extended trainings for therapists in our modality and what we've learned. Yeah, so that's the most exciting thing. And we're also really trying to potentially put together something where we can work with potentially psilocybin, someplace where it's, available.
Wow, then you really have the big three right there. Well, thank you so much for sharing about your work here at Innate Path. It's been fascinating, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks a lot.
Greener Grass is a BlueBird Botanicals podcast. Their CBD oil supports a healthy body and a strong endocannabinoid system. They've got friendly customer service who can answer any of your questions, and the number is right there at the top of their webpage. But, per the FDA, they won't be able to make any medical claims for these nutritional supplements. That's also the reason you'll hear little about CBD on this show. There's no need for us to add more evidence about CBD when a simple Google search will give you more than you can read in a month of Sundays. So this show covers the cannabis world and more with editorial freedom from BlueBird Botanicals. Thanks for joining the Greener Grass podcast. As always, our audio alchemist is Matt Payne. The Gypsy Jazz theme music comes from Brett Van Donsel. Our beautiful bird sounds are courtesy of Lang Elliott. And I'm your host, Lex Pelger, wishing you a bright green day.